Lesson 8.8, Factoring by Grouping. The objective of this lesson is to factor higher degree polynomials by grouping. Vocabulary. Factoring by grouping is a method of factoring that uses the distributive property to remove a common binomial factor of two pairs of terms. For example, the expression 7x times x minus 1 plus 4 times x minus 1 can be factored as 7x plus 4 times x minus 1. Some polynomials of a degree greater than 2 can be factored. In Lesson 8.6, you factored trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c by rewriting bx as a sum of two monomials. You then grouped the terms in pairs, factored the GCF from each pair, and looked for a common binomial factor. This process is called factoring by grouping. You can extend this technique to higher degree polynomials. Problem 1. Factoring a cubic polynomial. What is the factored form of 3n cubed minus 12n squared plus 2n minus 8? First thing you want to do here is you want to factor out the GCF of each group of two terms. So you see how there are four terms here. So I'm going to draw a line after the second term. So we're going to look at 3n cubed minus 12n squared, and we're going to factor out the GCF of that. And the GCF of that binomial is 3n squared. When I factor it out, I'm left with n minus 4. That was the first group. The second group is 2n minus 8. The GCF of that is 2. When I factor out 2, I'm left with n minus 4. The last step is to factor out the common factor, which is what they have in common, and here we have n minus 4 in common, so we factor that out, and we're left with 3n squared plus 2. That goes in the other parentheses. So our final answer is 3n squared plus 2 times n minus 4. And remember, you can always check your answer by multiplying the binomials together. Factoring a polynomial completely. Before factoring by grouping, you may need to factor out the GCF of all of the terms. Problem 2. What is the factored form of 4q to the fourth minus 8q cubed plus 12q squared minus 24q? So we have four terms here. Now, if they all have q in common, you know that q has to be part of the GCF. And remember, look at the smallest coefficient. That is 4. And ask yourself, is 4 a factor of all of the other coefficients? And in this case, it is. So the GCF is 4q. So the first thing you want to do is you want to factor out this huge polynomial. We want to factor out the GCF. So when we take out a 4q, we're left with q cubed minus 2q squared plus 3q minus 6. And like I said in previous lessons, once you factor out the GCF just comes along for the ride. Now we're looking at what's inside parentheses, and we're going to factor out that. So inside parentheses, I have four terms, so I'm going to factor by grouping again. I'm going to draw my little vertical line past the second term. So I'm going to factor out the GCF of these two terms first, which is q squared. And when I factor out q squared, I'm left with q minus 2. Then I'm going to look at 3q minus 6. I'm going to factor out the GCF, and the GCF there is 3, and I'm left with q minus 2. Remember, when we're factoring out the GCF of each group of two terms, we want to make sure that our parentheses, whatever terms are inside parentheses, are the same. So again, the GCF 4q comes along for the ride, and we factor by grouping. So our final answer is 4q times q squared plus 3 times q minus 2. So here's a summary of how we're factoring polynomials. So you're going to want to have this checklist because eventually you're going to get to problems, especially in this lesson, we're just going to say factor. So you're going to want to know what to start off with. First thing is you always look for the GCF. Now, if the polynomial doesn't have to have GCF, then you skip to step 2. If it does have a GCF, then you factor it out and you bring that GCF along for the ride until you get to the final answer. Step 2. If the polynomial has 2 or 3 terms, you're going to look for a difference of squares, a perfect square trinomial, or a pair of binomial factors. If the polynomial has more than 2 or 3 terms, you're going to skip to step 3. If it has 4 or more terms, you're going to group the terms and factor to find common binomial factors. And step 4, as a final check, make sure that there are no common factors other than 1. So let's use these steps to help us with a couple of problems. Number 1, what is the factored form of 8t cubed plus 14t squared plus 20t plus 35? First step that we're looking at is we're looking for a GCF. Well, I don't see t in every single term, so I know that's not the GCF, can't be part of it. I know 20 and 35 have 5 as a common factor, but 5 doesn't go into 14 and 8. So in this case, we don't have a GCF. But I see that there are 4 terms. So I'm going to factor by grouping because that's my only option. So let's look at 8t cubed plus 14t squared. My GCF here is going to be 2t squared. When I factor out a 2t squared, I'm left with 4t plus 7. And then I don't worry about that anymore. Now I look at the other group of two terms. I have 20t plus 35. My GCF is going to be positive 5. When I factor out a positive 5, I'm left with 4t plus 7. And I know I'm correct here, and I can go straight to my final answer because my common binomial factor is 4t plus 7. So my final answer is going to be 2t squared plus 5 times 4t plus 7. Let's look at one more. What is the factored form of 6h to the 4th plus 9h cubed plus 12h squared plus 18h? Again, we're looking for a GCF here. I see that there's h in every single term, so I know that's going to be part of my GCF. So I know I have a GCF here. And then I look at my coefficients. I have 6, 9, 12, and h. They all have 3 in common, so my GCF is 3h. When I factor out a 3h, I'm left with 2h cubed plus 3h squared plus 4h plus 6. Now, this is what I'm talking about. We took care of the GCF. So now I just like drawing my little arrow, bring my GCF down for the ride, and now I don't care about it anymore. Looking inside these parentheses, I have 4 terms. So my only option here is factor by grouping. So let's look at the first set of 2 terms, 2h cubed and 3h squared. My GCF here is h squared. I'm going to factor out an h squared, and I'm going to be left with 2h plus 3. Okay? Then I'm going to look at my second set. Over here, my GCF is going to be positive 2. When I factor out a positive 2, I'm left with 2h plus 3. And again, I know that I can go directly to my final answer because my common binomial factor is 2h plus 3. So again, I'm going to bring down my GCF. It comes along until I get to the final answer, 3h times my common binomial factor is 2h plus 3. And my other is going to be h squared plus 2. Again, you've been dealing with factoring different types of problems every single lesson. Where in lesson 8, we're introducing factoring by grouping, and then we're just putting everything together. So kind of like a big conclusion to factoring.